All right, eighth grade. So we're going to do a very short lesson today for social studies. We're going to be starting on, I think, slide 13. We're going to talk about U.S. foreign policy and the Monroe Doctrine during the presidencies of Andrew Jackson all the way through James Monroe. So before I start, since this is the first video I'm doing using this whiteboard, I want to see how this appears on the screen. I don't know how well you guys can see that, but if you can't see it, too bad. I guess I'm never going to know because you guys can't talk right now, which is awesome. All right, so we're going to start with the major U.S. foreign policy achievements and events of the first half of the 19th century. So basically we're going to start with the War of 1812, and then we're going to go all the way through Canada, its relations with Canada. So we know that after the War of 1812 was over, and after the Louisiana Purchase had occurred, the United States had primary control over North America. European countries were basically relegated to Canada in the case of Great Britain, and to Florida and Mexico and parts of the West Coast in the case of Spain. Other European countries are going to have influence in Central and South America, which is going to be relevant when we get to the Monroe Doctrine. But right now you don't need to worry about that. So down in Florida, we have a lot going on. So Spain is in control of Florida, but Spain is getting weaker and weaker as each year progresses. So a couple hundred years ago, Spain was the most dominant, powerful country in the New World. They controlled basically everything south of Canada. And now, by the end of the War of 1812, Spain controls just little bits and pieces of North America. Again, it still controls a lot of Mexico and the West Coast, but basically everybody sees the writing on the wall. Everybody knows eventually the United States is going to take Florida away from Spain. It's not a question of if, but when. So why does the U.S. want control of Florida? Well, Florida is a very attractive piece of land, right? It has a nice climate. It's got a lot of arable land that can be used for plantations. Of course, it's a coastal area, so this could be really important for trade with both Europe and Caribbean nations. So Spain is very, very attractive to the United States. The United States wants Spain. But right now, it still belongs to Florida. Right? Well, U.S. interest in in Florida, basically explodes when a bunch of slaves in Florida escape and join with the Seminole tribe, which is located in Florida, and they begin attacking American settlements outside of Florida. So now the United States has an excuse to actually do something, to go into Florida and use its military force or use threats to try to gain control of Florida. Right, so Andrew Jackson brings a bunch of U.S. forces into Florida. Remember, he's the commander of much of the southern United States military. He brings a bunch of soldiers into Florida, and he starts raiding Seminole villages, and he does this in order to try to recapture a bunch of escaped slaves with the justification that, hey, I'm just protecting all of these southern settlements outside of Florida that are under attack. But Jackson doesn't just do that, right? He goes a lot farther than just attacking Seminole villages. In fact, he starts attacking Florida's Spanish towns. So these are towns occupied by Spanish citizens of Spain. And at one point, in fact, one of the towns he attacks is the home of the governor of Florida, who is under the control of the King and Queen of Spain. And he forces this governor of Florida to flee, to leave his house. So basically, it's really, really clear that the U.S. can take Spain whenever it wants, and eventually it's going to do so. All right, so now we're on slide 14. So Spain isn't able to protect Florida. Spain sees the writing on the wall. They figure it's better to give up Florida in a diplomatic way than to lose it, basically having the U.S. military beat them in an arm wrestling match and just forcibly take it from them. So in 1819, Spain signs a treaty called the Adams-Onis Treaty, or Adams-Onis Treaty. I actually don't know how you pronounce that. And this treaty gives Florida to the United States, right? And in exchange, the United States is basically going to leave all the Spanish citizens alone and let them go and move somewhere else, right? So Spain doesn't really get much out of the treaty, but they do get to save face a little bit because they don't get beat down by the United States in a military way. So losing Florida wasn't actually really that big of a deal to Spain because Spain had been losing territory in the New World for a really long time, and Florida was just the latest domino to fall in that chain of events. And in fact, the reason this was happening is because a lot of Spanish territories, especially in the Caribbean and in Central America and South America, were inspired by the U.S. Revolution, and they wanted freedom from Spain's control. So Spain had been trying to put down a lot of rebellions over the course of the last few years, and they're failing to do this because Spain, unlike Britain, was not powerful enough to actually fight back against a lot of these rebels. So Spain is going to lose Mexico, they're going to lose basically all of Central America, and they're going to lose basically all of South America. Right? So, in fact, by the year 1825, all of Latin America is now free from Spanish control. These are now independent countries. And this leads us to the Monroe Doctrine. All right, so now we're on the next slide, the Monroe Doctrine. So Spain has basically lost control of almost all of its holdings in the New World, and France and Russia and a few other European countries don't like that Spain lost all of its control. They don't like that Europe is basically losing the power battle against nations like the United States in the New World. Right? So all these European nations see that Spain is getting really weak and starting to crumble, and they want to fill that power vacuum. So they threaten to help Spain regain a bunch of nations and territories. Now, they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart, right? France and Russia aren't like, oh, poor Spain, we need to help them. No. For much of their history, Spain and France, for example, were mortal enemies. So France is hoping that if they help Spain regain control, then France is going to get a big slice of the pie, right? They're going to get trade advantages. They're going to get access to different kinds of resources in the New World, maybe even land that they didn't have before. So France and Russia and a few other European countries are looking at all this territory that Spain lost through rebellions, and they're thinking, ooh, I want to take it back, right? Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought because it's really awkward teaching a empty classroom with no one interrupting me. So I'm just going to say a few things that I would normally be saying to kids at this time. Matthew, pay attention. Martin, take your earphones off. Josette, put your elbows down. I'm scared. All right, back to the Monroe Doctrine. In the United States, we have President Monroe. and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who's the son of the second president of the United States, John Adams. And both Monroe and John Quincy Adams are afraid that if there's a lot of chaos in the New World with France and Russia trying to help Spain get back its lost territory, this is going to mess up U.S. Trade in the New World, right? Remember, the United States is starting to grow, right? It's kind of going through its adolescent period, and it needs a lot of resources, right? It is a growing boy, and it needs all kinds of inputs from the outside world to feed its growth, right? It wants to grow up to be big and strong, not sickly, so it needs healthy trade relations with European countries, but also with nations that formerly belonged to Spain. So Britain gets into the mix here, right? Britain is thinking, we're not really on board with all of these other European countries going in and taking all these former Spanish colonies back. So Britain suggests that it makes a deal with the United States, right? Britain kind of wants to go behind the backs of the other European countries and make this secret deal with the United States. So Britain suggests to the United States that together they issue a joint declaration that neither Britain nor the United States would allow European nations to threaten the freedom of these new Latin American nations. Right? Now again, Britain isn't doing this out of the goodness of its heart. Britain has secret motives for doing this as well. Britain wants more control of these Latin American nations, and it thinks if it joins with the United States, it's more likely to achieve control than if it has to share control with all the European countries that want to get involved. So they basically want to kick all the other European countries out and just have Britain and the United States kind of share control of all of these territories in Latin America, right? Britain also wants to appear that it's still in control of the United States. They want to be able to say, hey, we issued this piece of advice to the United States and they followed it. This shows that the United States does whatever we tell them to do. Right? And this is exactly what John Quincy Adams is afraid of. So John Quincy Adams says, Britain's right. We need to make sure all these European nations don't take away the freedom of the Latin American nations, but we don't want to give the appearance that Britain is telling us what to do, right? If we do what Britain says and issue a joint declaration with them, we're going to look weak. And it's really important that we look strong on the international stage right now, right? We can't look like we're following Britain's orders. So together, Monroe and Adams decide that the United States needs to act alone on this issue. So in the year 1823, President Monroe gives this big speech to Congress in which he basically talks about something called the Monroe Doctrine. Right? So a doctrine is a teaching or a belief system. President Monroe is believed to be the first president who made his doctrines for his presidency really clear, right? He gave it explicitly in a speech to Congress. And some other presidents throughout history are going to do this as well. Off the top of my head, I believe Franklin Delano Roosevelt does this. Actually, Teddy Roosevelt does this too. George W. Bush does this. And in a certain way, President Trump does this as well, right? Where he speaks in front of Congress, he speaks to the media, he speaks in front of people, and makes it really, really clear what is motivating his presidency. So President Monroe's doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, is basically the belief that the U.S. would consider any European interference in Latin America to be, quote unquote, dangerous to our peace and safety. So in other words, if Britain or France or Russia or any European country tries to mess with Latin America, the United States is going to interpret that as an act of an aggression against the United States and maybe use the U.S. military in response. Right. So basically, the United States military is threatening to use military force to to react against any European interference in North America, Central America, and possibly even South America, although it would have been really interesting to see how the United States would respond if a European country tried to do something in South America, because it's so far away from the United States. I think it's unlikely that the US would really be able to respond. So earlier I said the United States is kind of going through an adolescent period. It's kind of like a teenager at this point. The countries of Europe know the US military is actually not very strong, right? They got through the War of 1812 because the British kind of just said, it's not really worth fighting this war anymore. Economically speaking, it's better if we have a positive trade relationship with the United States than if we keep trying to go to war with them. But the United States, of course, thinks that, well, basically we won the war, so we're the most powerful country in the world. That is definitely not true at this point. So all these European countries know that if push came to shove, they could probably still, for the most part, overpower the United States military, but it would be very, very costly to do so. And they don't want to do that. It's not worth it. U.S. Navy, especially, is still not powerful after President Jefferson had scaled back spending on the United States military. Remember at the beginning of the War of 1812, how big was the U.S. military? Oh yeah, that's right, you can't answer. Well, it was very small. In fact, the U.S. Navy only had a handful of ships, and there was like just a few thousand soldiers. That was it. So it's kind of miraculous that the United States was able to survive through all this turmoil with such a tiny military, but they were. So the Monroe Doctrine has the effect of increasing the United States' power and presence in the entire Western Hemisphere, not just North America. The U.S. is barking really loud at this point, and nobody wants to find out if the U.S. actually has a bite. All right, last slide and then we'll stop. Slide 16, United States relations with Canada. So now we get to move to an area on which I am an expert, love triangles. So we have Canada, oops, I can spell. Canada, the US, and Britain. All right. So basically, this is, again, in the first half of the 19th century, starting with the end of the War of 1812, all the way to the 1840s, I believe. So Britain has we'll call it a love relationship with Canada, right? Britain and Canada are kind of sort of together, right? Well, the U.S. is looking at Canada as well, and the U.S. is thinking, well, we like Canada. We don't want Britain to have this relationship with Canada. We like Canada. And we think we can convince Canada to like us back. Right? Again, sorry if you can't see this, but I can't tell because this isn't live and there are no comments yet. The U.S. Loves Canada. Canada kind of sort of loves Britain. Britain loves Canada. The U.S. wants to take Canada away from Britain, right? Well, Canada does not like the U.S. Canada is mad that the United States is just assuming that Canada is willing to leave Britain and go be with the United States, right? And so the U.S. gets rejected by Canada, right? Canada gets mad. So when Canada rejects the United States goes, okay, I can take a hint, and they back off, but not completely, right? The U.S. accepts that maybe it's never going to have Canada, but it's thinking, well, if we can't be with Canada, I don't want Britain to be with Canada either, right? If I can't have Canada, then nobody can. That's the idea. So, it can't stand the idea that Britain is going to be able to have Canada all for itself. So the United States starts behaving very, very aggressively at the United States-Canadian border. And as the US is growing more and more powerful as the years pass, Britain becomes really possessive and really controlling of Canada. Because Britain is looking at this teenage boy, the United States, and it's thinking, uh-oh, this teenage boy is starting to grow up and become pretty powerful. And we don't like that the US could potentially threaten our relationship with Canada. Right? So Britain gets really possessive and really controlling of Canada, and Canada gets mad at Britain and is like, hey, Britain, back up. Our relationship isn't that serious. You can't control every little thing that I'm doing. Right? Canada's angry, but instead of rejecting Britain, Canada says to Britain, hey, Britain, if you want to have a more controlling, possessive, or at least economically beneficial relationship with us, you better put a ring on it, right? And Britain goes, okay. So in the year 1841, Canada and Britain formed something called the Act of Union, which is very similar to a marriage between two countries. Right? So the Act of Union gives Britain and Canada shared authority over the entire territory of Canada. Remember, Canada is huge, right? It's a massive, massive amount of territory, and a lot of it is frozen for most of the year, so it's not particularly valuable land. But around the United States border, the Great Lakes, around New York and Maine and places like that, Canadian land is very, very, very important and valuable. So both Britain and Canada, through the Act of Union, have shared authority over Canada, and the U.S. is very upset about this marriage between the two countries, and it continues to try to press at Canada's border. But over time, the U.S. finally accepts, well, I guess we lost. Britain and Canada are together forever, and we're never going to have Canada for ourselves, right? So the U.S. backs off permanently and says to Britain and Canada, okay, I accept the border as it is. We're not going to be aggressive at the border anymore. And amazingly, from this point on, from 1841 on, all three countries, Britain, United States, and Canada, have been very, very close friends, right? Very, very close allies. They're culturally similar. They're ethnically similar for most of that history, religiously similar. And all of these kind of feed into a shared identity between the three of them. But it all happened because the U.S. decided to use common sense and back off and let Canada and Britain live happily ever after. All right, that's it. We'll continue with more either tomorrow or Wednesday. I haven't decided yet, so have a nice day from the 100 Acre Hood. Peace out.